This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner, the Center for Audit Quality, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome back one of our most treasured guests. I'd like to welcome back Cindy Fornelli, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality. Welcome, Cindy.
Thanks. It's great to be here again, as always.
Well, we have a specific topic to talk about, and that is Sarbanes-Oxley. We are 10 years in. As of July 30th, I believe, marked 10 years. I know you did a very significant event bringing both Sarbanes and Oxley back for a discussion. I'm sure that that was very interesting. But we want to talk about a little bit about Sarbanes-Oxley looking back, but more importantly, we want to talk a little bit about sort of what now. So I know that people have been talking about the 10th anniversary just because it was such a big event in the boardrooms, but we're also seeing it talked about sort of on the Hill in Congress and by politicians, and so why is it sort of look like Sarbanes-Oxley has become a political issue?
Well, you're right, it has. You've heard both candidates, candidate Romney and President Obama, talk about Sarbanes-Oxley and whether or not it should be repealed. And I think the simple reason for that, to boil it down, is that it's about the economy. We are, as you know, and as your viewers know, in a very difficult, prolonged economic crisis or downturn, and I think politicians are looking for a way to buttress companies and help companies save money where they can. And so for some reason, Sarbanes-Oxley has become a target for their sightlines. I think, though, if you look at all of Sarbanes-Oxley, there were a lot of corporate governance and other reforms that were in Sarbanes-Oxley. And when people target Sarbanes-Oxley, I think what they're really focusing on, they forget the creation of the PCAOB, they forget the independence of the auditors, but what they focus on is what's commonly referred to as Section 404, specifically 404B. And that is the provision that requires, 404A requires companies to have strong internal controls. 404B requires independent auditors to come in and attest to those internal controls, the robustness of those internal controls. And so people have focused on that because, frankly, when 404B was first implemented, it was very costly, and companies had to spend a lot of money and a lot of time to buttress their internal control systems, and then the auditors had to come in and test those internal controls, so it was a costly endeavor. But there were other provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley that I think the marketplace and investors certainly, but also management and boards of directors find very helpful.
Well, there was no question that 404 had a lot of work involved with it, and probably because part of that was startup. But the question that I get related to Sarbanes-Oxley is, why didn't it sort of, with all this accountability, why didn't it prevent the financial crisis, or was a piece of the financial crisis sort of the non-compliance by companies of Sarbanes-Oxley?
Right. Why didn't SOX prevent the financial crisis? We actually discussed that with Senator Sarbanes and Representative Oxley. And the simple answer is Sarbanes-Oxley was designed for financial reporting fraud. If you look at the marketplace when Sarbanes-Oxley came into effect, it was after the financial reporting scandals from the turn of the century, which makes me sound old to say the turn of the century, but I guess it was 12 years ago now.
Depresses us all.
Yes. And so the current crisis, I think by any analysis, is really more about business risk and the level of business risk that companies took. So did they have too much leverage? Did financial institutions have too much leverage? Were there too many loans being made, mortgages to unworthy or less than stellar borrowers? how they package those mortgages. Those were really the issues, I think, surrounding and some of the root causes of the current financial crisis. And if you look at the legislation and the reforms and the regulation that has come out of this crisis, that's what they're looking at, is trying to get to the business risk. So it really was not about financial reporting. So I would argue that Sarbanes-Oxley worked very well. You didn't have those issues of faulty financial reporting, and I think that investors were well served and continue to be well served by the reforms in Sarbanes-Oxley.
Well, knowing that that's the overall feeling, let's dig down a little bit. And what would be the center's opinion of how relevant, you know, the specific legislation is, and are there things that you feel should be changed today?
Well, I don't necessarily think that things need to be changed today under Sarbanes-Oxley, but as we talked about a few moments ago, where there is a focus is on Section 404B, and whether or not that's too costly of a provision, whether or not companies could forego having to comply with Section 404B, that is the external auditor attestation, and still have the protections that Sarbanes-Oxley was meant to have. And certainly we've already seen some reforms, if you will, in that arena, in that the Jobs Act has carved out a large section of public companies from having to comply with Section 404B. These are the emerging growth companies and other companies that qualify under the Jobs Act. I worry about those exemptions and those exclusions, frankly, because I think it puts a focus, an increased focus on boards of directors. If the external auditor isn't going to come in and attest to a company's internal controls, you're losing a line of defense there. And I would posit that boards of directors are now going to have to step into that fold and make sure that companies do have those robust internal controls, are doing what they need to be doing to make sure that they have good financial reporting. And if the auditors aren't fulfilling that role, I think the boards are going to have to step in there, and they're going to have more scrutiny on them and query whether or not they're as well trained and well versed and expert enough to fill that role. Certainly some of them are, but perhaps some of them aren't.
Yeah. Well, you know, to push back to this, to the concern that you have is obviously centered around cost and the cost of doing that. So how do you answer the critics that say, you know, that the cost isn't worth the prevention at this point?
Well, the costs were, let's be honest, when Sarbanes-Oxley was first implemented and Section 404 first came into effect, especially 404B, the costs were very high. But a lot has changed in the 10 years since 404 was implemented. You've had the PCAOB go back and actually redo the standard under 404B so that it's more scalable, so auditors can scale the work depending on the company, how complex the company is, how sturdy and robust their internal controls are. So there's economies of scale that auditors can put into place looking at 404B. You also had the SEC step forward when they first put in 404B, when Congress did. There was no guidance to companies as to how they needed to do their internal controls. The SEC has since stepped in. And of course, over time, people become better at it, more adept, and more efficient. And that's not just my personal opinion. Congress mandated in 2010 that the SEC come forward and do a study on the impacts of 404B and the cost of 404B. And they indeed have come down significantly over the past 5 years.
Well, nobody, I'm sure, would think the cost is very high if it prevents some of the debacles. I'm sure we would have paid significant money in prevention not to have the financial crisis happen. So it's always a tough issue with what is the proper amount of investment into prevention so that we don't have those kinds of errors.
Well, and it's hard to prove a negative, right? It's hard to prove what could have happened or would have happened had we not had those controls in place.
You know, SOX really put the focus on the audit committees and the outside auditors, and certainly with the formation of the PCAOB was a big deal, or it certainly seems to be a big deal today. You know, that's sort of looking over the hub of the integrity of what's happening company's financial reporting and with their external audit. But in your opinion, what else should or could be done to sort of strengthen and educate the audit committees? And maybe the other question is, has the PCAOB gone too far?
Well, you're right. There's a lot of focus on audit committees right now because they are a linchpin to the process. They oversee the external auditor. It's their responsibility to stand in the shoes of the investors, if you will, and to hire, fire, and oversee the work of the external auditor. And so people often ask me, which I think is a corollary to the question that you're asking me, is are audit committees doing enough? Are they good enough? And I think that audit committees are doing a good job by and large. But as with most things, you see a variety of different levels of performance by audit committees. So I think it behooves everybody to look at the role that audit committees play and ask how can their role be strengthened and how can the level of performance be brought up to a higher level so that all audit committees are functioning where the best audit committees currently function. And so I think that there are a few key areas that audit committees should look at. And the first is, do they have the right training and education that they need to both understand the financial reporting process as well as to understand their company, their particular company? And so, do they need more training? Do they have a financial expert that sits on the audit committee? Are there more that they could be doing? And Sarbanes-Oxley actually contemplates, and in fact, one could argue even encourages, that if audit committees need to, they should be able to go out and hire outside experts to help them get the expertise that they need to oversee the auditor robustly. Another big area, I think, is really overseeing, having a robust process to oversee the external auditor. How does the audit committee assess the external auditor to make sure that they're doing their best so that investors take comfort in the fact that audit committees are there having an oversight role, the oversight role that they're meant to have, and make sure that they're doing that? And in my mind, that requires an annual assessment of the auditor. And then the third area that I think is really important and probably doesn't get as much attention as it could and should is, how do audit committees, even the best audit committees, how are they communicating what they're doing to investors? Again, they're there to sit in the shoes of investors, to represent investors' interests. And so communicating with investors, helping investors understand how it is that they're fulfill their responsibilities, I think is very important. And as you know, the CAQ is working with organizations such as yours to bring more focus to that and to find ways, both for the oversight of the audit, the assessment of the audit, as well as the communication with investors.
Well, there's nothing that helps the situation more than being informed. So let's hope that the recommendations that you just made are going to be carried through. Let's hope that Sarbanes-Oxley continues with its good reputation on making a difference. And as always, it's a pleasure to have you join us, bringing everybody up to speed about what's happening in the audit committee meetings. And with that, again, Cindy, thanks for joining us. One comment I want to make before we part today. In all the studies and communications that we've had recently with you as directors, you have told us that the issue that is most concerning you these days, which relates to the audit committee, is the issue of cyber and IT risk. And I want to remind everybody that on October 18th in Chicago, corporate board member will be holding the Board IT Challenge, oversight of cloud, cyber risk, and social media. And this is an opportunity for directors to really get their arms around what they may not know about cloud and social media, but in addition to that, what they need to know to be on top of cyber risk, which again has been identified as the #1 knowledge gap that the board has right now. So we'll look forward to seeing you there if you have the opportunity. And with that, that will conclude another session of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you join us next week when we'll take a look at another critical issue that will help you be a better director and a better committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner, the Center for Audit Quality, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.